Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I am here with Dr. Jessica Tollette. Jessica is the academic director of the Bachelor in Behavior and Social Sciences at University. She has experience teaching courses on research methods, race, gender, and education. Her research interests include race, ethnicity, immigration, and intergroup relations. Jess's previous research examines immigration policy, immigrant integration, and intergroup relations in Madrid. She has previously received several awards and grants to conduct her research, including a Fulbright grant to Spain. And in addition to teaching and research, Jess has also worked extensively with undergraduates in the realm of diversity, inclusion, and pre-career and academic advising. Prior to obtaining her Ph.D., she worked as a management consultant at Monitor Group, where she specialized in marketing consulting and diversity recruitment. She received her MA and Ph.D. in sociology at Harvard University and graduated magna cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in communication. Jess, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's jump right in, because we had a great conversation before we hit the record, so hopefully I can remember all this super fun and interesting things we were talking about. But let's start with your position, your current position at IE as the academic director, as I said. So you are, I think, probably the first guest. I've had academics on the past, but it's usually the type of academic that's like, a PI with they have a big program of research, and they kind of do as little teaching as humanly possible. It's like usually like 90% and 10%, and which is like, that's their prerogative, I suppose. But you have this dedicated and distinct interest in teaching. So can you tell us a little bit more of your current position, how you got there, because it's a really sort of unique one, it seems like, and what your philosophy is of mentoring the next wave of behavioral science professionals?
Yeah, so I'm the founding academic director of IE's Bachelor in Behavior and Social Sciences. I got there with a bit of a circuitous path because, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm not a behavioral scientist. I'm putting that in air quotes. I'm a sociologist. So I came to Madrid to do my research for my dissertation. I studied race and ethnicity, and I was thinking about immigrant integration into Spanish society. And I fell in love with Spain and Spanish culture. So as opposed to my colleagues who are graduating from our PhD program looking for tenure track jobs in the US, I was like, I want to go work with immigrants in Spain, and I'm getting off the academic track entirely. Instead, I found this job randomly because there's a Fulbright connection between IE and the Fulbright program, and several of my colleagues who had done the Fulbright the same year as me were like, why don't you work at IE? It's in Madrid, but it's an English-speaking university. And I said, I don't really want to do academia. But for one reason or another, I was then put in touch with a Spanish colleague of mine from Harvard who was at the time working at IE. So I submitted my CV, and they're like, listen, we're starting this new bachelor degree program in behavioral science. And of course, I was like, Google, what is behavioral science? Because I was a sociologist, I did race stuff, I did immigration, it wasn't really my background. But the more that I learned about what behavioral science was and, the objective of the program, which was kind of combining this idea of psychology with other aspects of social sciences, I put my name in for the job and I ended up getting it. And in the past 3.5 years, I have been building the program from the ground up. So that's starting with submitting the application to the Ministry of Education with our 4-year study plan, which means, in the US, you have different courses that you could take over your bachelor. In Spain, you kind of know what your entire courses are, spring and fall semester, every year that you're in your bachelor degree program. So we had to put together the courses, which is really when I got my feet wet in the field. And I understood, okay, here are the classes that you need to have in order to call yourself a behavioral scientist. So in doing that work, I was designing courses around behavioral economics and decision-making, around behavioral design, welfare and policy design, basic psychology courses like cognition and emotion or organizational behavior. So you'll see in the study plan for this bachelor that you get a little taste of sociology, anthropology, obviously psychology. You get a little taste of economics, political science, and then we give you a business background because IE is at its base a business school, and the university kind of grew around the business school. So for me, becoming a behavioral scientist is about putting together all these courses. And then in doing that process, I realized that there was one course that was missing, which is this first year course that I designed that's actually called Becoming a Behavioral Scientist, where I teach the students, what is a cognitive bias? Like, let's learn some cognitive biases in order to teach ourselves what we're planning to do with this bachelor. And let's talk to some real behavioral scientists. Let's do a project where we use behavioral science with good intentions. There's a lot of that talk of behavioral science for good within the field. So the students in their first year really get their feet wet because they kind of join the bachelor without actually knowing what behavioral science is. Most of our student profile is someone who's interested in psychology, interested in, human behavior, right? So behavior and social sciences, it's in the title, but they don't know what behavioral science is. And so this course that I now teach, it kind of gets their feet wet and introduces them to what they have to look forward to over the course of the 4 years, but also in their professional career as a behavioral scientist.
So that's really interesting, and there's a lot of really interesting things in there in what you're doing as part of your job. And it's super exciting. And I remember talking to a lot of undergraduate students who I was teaching, and they were in fourth year seminars, so like 6 months from graduation, and they loved psychology. They were majoring in psychology, and some of them wanted to go to med school, and some of them wanted to go to grad school for to do basic research. But the vast majority were sort of just totally had no idea what they wanted to do, other than the fact that they loved psychology and sort of human behavior and social and behavioral sciences. And so they would just come to me in such desperation towards the end of the course and be like, I'm almost done graduating. What do I do? What do I do with this? Is my only option to continue my education and sort of formal graduate training? And at that time, it's been a couple of years since I was in a classroom teaching, but at that time I would try and say to them, look, there's an entire market out there of these new jobs, and they're looking for applied behavioral scientists, behavioral practitioners, and it can span different industries, HR and product and marketing. I mean, you name it. And it's so the institution and their mentors and their teachers failed them because they were giving them this training in psychology and yet basically had no plans for what was next in their career. I think it was just assumed they would probably go on to do a postgrad in some way or graduate school. And I don't think that's how it should be. So it's really great to hear that there are these institutions and these programs that are doing that. So first of all, I just want to say that. And your third? So this is your first cohort will be coming into their fourth year, right? Their final year.
They're starting their fourth year next September.
Okay. How big was the first cohort? How many students?
Right now we're at about 33. We had a little bit of attrition. Maybe we lost 3 or 4 students over the past couple of years.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good attrition rate.
Yeah, and they're brave because they're the first ones, and so they're awesome. But it's 33 students who this cohort is a little more interested in pure psychology than the ones that follow, because I think in the past 2 or 3 years, both the university and the world of behavioral science has done a really good job of getting our brand out there. What are we? What do we do? What are behavioral science jobs? So now finding out what it means to study behavioral science is a little bit easier than it was 3 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And we can sort of prime those students who are leaving high school and sort of asking themselves, or their parents are asking them, what do you want to do next? And they're like, oh, I've actually come across this of behavioral science. It sounds really interesting. Sounds like it can work well with my love for understanding humans and human nature. And that's sort of that is our job as a a field of professionals calling us behavioral scientists. That's our job and our responsibility to get the word out there that there is this thing, that there is this job. And we have to focus on focus on it from the very beginning. That's like first year undergrad and all the way through, and whether we then pull that from the talent pool after their 4-year bachelor, or whether we pull them from the masters or from PhD, at all levels, it's incumbent on us as a field to ensure that we have sort of a good succession. So this is really exciting that this exists. I'll go back. You fell in love with Madrid. How come?
I don't know. Like I come from, a really particular American work ethic, which is work yourself to the bone. And, 15 days of vacation is what you get after working for a few years. You have to earn it. And the lifestyle in Spain and in Madrid particularly is like, they love to have a work-life balance. Like I have a vacation day today. It's a Monday in November for some holiday. I had vacation last Monday. So there's a lot of time that they spend doing leisure and enjoying themselves. Anyone across the social class spectrum is going to be certain to be out of office for the month of August because they take vacations and they honor that. And I respect that about them as a culture. I study immigration and I love this idea of being a foreigner and exploring and understanding different cultures and adapting to different cultures. I've always been that way. I studied abroad in Barcelona when I was an undergrad, and I think that was like the first taste that I got of the Spanish lifestyle. And going to the beach after class in undergrad was enough to bring me back here for my Ph.D. research. So it's a wonderful country. It's an open country. It is a professional opportunity that I couldn't really say no to because it's entrepreneurial and academic and adventurous and rigorous. It's a lot of things that it brought together a lot of my skills and skills that I would like to develop. So it just kind of was the gift that I got after suffering through 7 years of my PhD program. Let's say that.
Yeah, that's really cool. And back to your students. So what's I'm assuming it's a range, like quite a diverse group in terms of just demographics. What does that cohort, that 33 cohort look like?
Yeah. So to give a little background, IE is a very international university. So although it's based in Madrid and in Segovia, we have 2 campuses in Spain. It's global. Its population is global. I would say something like at least 3/4 of the students are not Spanish or have some sort of joint nationality. There's of the 33 students, I could say that we speak at least 15 languages. There's at least 20 different passport holders. We have students from South America, Asia, North America, France, Germany, Spain, obviously, North Africa. So it's really a diverse group of students in terms of geography, gender, interest. It embodies a lot of diversity, and that's what makes it so fun to teach them and learn from them as an academic director, but also in my role as a professor where, they're teaching me about their cultures in Lebanon and in Brazil. And it's awesome.
Yeah, that was one when I was at the Scarborough campus of University of Toronto, which is a really unique campus just because of the demographic makeup and the diversity in the Greater Toronto area. So for when I was teaching, it was about 80% was South Asian, East Asian, Middle Eastern, and as a kind of boring monocultural white guy from like white suburbia like Toronto, they really I was teaching them cross-cultural psychology, but really they were the ones teaching me about the really interesting things like with their cultural experiences and their heritage culture. So I can definitely relate to that. Now your students, so you have this mix of the next wave of behavioral scientists, and they're being trained. Are they, after they graduate, do you get the sense that they'll want to stay, or will they go back to, home, wherever home may be, and then sort of pick up their behavioral science torch in their own countries and geographies?
Yeah. So now that they're in their 3rd year, they're starting to think about what comes after graduation because they're past the halfway point. And I've had conversations where I'm like, yeah, it would be so great for you to go back to Peru. And I found this behavioral science company on LinkedIn, and they're like, no, I'm open to going to other places. Many of them fall in love with Madrid and want to stay in Spain. So there's going to be a group of people who come from different countries who are like, no, I want to stay in Spain for a little bit longer. So they might try to look for stuff there. There's always people who want to go to other English-speaking countries, the US, the UK. and look for jobs there. And obviously in the field of behavioral science, the US and the UK are two great options for professional opportunities. But I think because they don't know what's out there, and I think we're kind of figuring out as we go along, they're sort of open-minded. I mean, we connected with Busara this year, and so now I'm sure there will be students who find Busara and going to the Global South as an interesting opportunity to apply their behavioral science expertise, you know? So I like that behavioral science is becoming so global, you know?
Yeah. And that's the recent announcement of our initiative of GABS, the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, is exactly to do that, to ensure that our practice and the work that we're doing has a global reach, so that it's not just within the US or the UK, and that we need behavioral science and we need these professionals in every market and in every geography. And in fact, I'd say we need it in particular in those developing countries, like the Becerra Initiative and other similar ones that are now starting. So I think that's just really smart. And I hope that for people who are listening, whether they're students or whether they're in their organizations, that we start to be a little bit more responsible and strategic when asking the question, how are we training the next wave of behavioral science professionals? I think we just sort of found ourselves at this point in time where currently there was sort of the two general trajectories or paths to being a behavioral scientist. I know there's probably more nuance than that, but what I find is there was two types. There was like, you're in academia, usually in some sort of psychology or economics degree. You get a master's or a PhD, and you abandon, jump ship from academia and go into practice and industry, kind of like what I did. And then there's those who were like seasoned marketing professionals or HR professionals, and they read Dan Ariely's book and were like, holy shit, this is so cool. I want to do this in my field of X or Y. So we've sort of stumbled upon this identity of behavioral scientists. But now that we are here, we have to start to think about how do we bring the next wave of professionals. And I think that's through institutions like IE and these other initiatives. So I'm having conversations, just another example, with in social psychology, the biggest conference and one of the biggest journals, the sort of group is called SPSP, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. And they have, it's like 10,000 student members or something like that. And having been one of these students towards the end of my PhD and being like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I'm not doing academia. I'm absolutely panicking here. I know for a fact there's at least 40 to 50% of that 10,000 who are having similar moments of angst, wondering what the hell am I going to do next? Mm-hmm. And it shouldn't be that way. If these associations and these big groups are helping support their student members, they should actually be showing them, look at the opportunities that exist, and here they are. Now go out and talk to these people and listen to this podcast or read this book. Go on LinkedIn and form these communities. And I know it's happened. I know it's starting. It's just, I don't want to sound sort of like cynical and like pissed off about it. I think it's, I remain hopeful, especially when there's this work that you guys are doing at IE. So
I think we're getting a lot of help, actually, because sometimes people will write me and say, I'm really interested in behavioral science. Where do I go? And I'm like, okay, read this book, go listen to this podcast, go on LinkedIn and just search behavioral science. I feel like the behavioral science community, at least since I've been a part of it, and I definitely have felt like an outsider being a sociologist, but they've welcomed me with open arms. Everyone is like, I'm happy to, help you find your students internships. There's actually a lot of master programs that are growing in behavioral science. And I think it's important for us to link, but I think the idea of a student association within the field of behavioral science to be able to attend these types of conferences and be able to publish in journals, if that's what they want to do, right? Like that is an important community that if we haven't already developed that we should. I know for one that the students at IE, they've started a behavioral economics club. And so I'm in conversations with them, connecting them to some of my contacts on LinkedIn so that they can have guest speakers for their club. And they're like, we want to have a big behavioral science conference next spring. Like, what do we do? And so, of course, I go to LinkedIn, but they're also connected to the behavioral economics clubs at Warwick University and at LSE and at some universities in the States. Like, we're finding each other because it's such a small community. But I think that, as the administrators of bachelor programs and master's programs, as people who are starting behavioral science consulting firms or behavioral science branches within our organizations, we all need to have our ears open for how we can support and help, because that's what the community has done for me so far and for my students as well,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thank you for that note of optimism to counteract my my cynicism. I appreciate that. So I'm curious with the students, is it a mix of some will go into policy, some will go into private or for profit? What do you get a sense of different personalities of the next wave of behavioral scientists?
Yeah, so last year we started doing a survey to kind of figure out, because we have a little bit of flexibility in the study plan with the fourth year. In the fall, they have electives that they want to take. So we're like, what are your potential career paths? Where do you think that you want to go? Why did you choose this bachelor, et cetera, et cetera? A lot of them are interested in the bachelor because they saw behavior and thought psychology, and they're like, well, maybe I want to get a clinical master's. But if we talk about students who are actually interested in going into the behavioral science world, a lot of them are talking about policy or nonprofits. There's a lot of students who are really interested in using behavioral science within the nonprofit kind of space or government organizations type of thing. There's also a lot of students who are interested in HR. We want to do consulting. Remember, it's a business school, so marketing has a lot of attention and focus. And then consulting. And I'm seeing a lot of behavioral science consulting firms just like popping into my life. And so I'm taking it as a sign that it's a growing business and that you guys are hiring. So please hire my students. Yeah. They will find you on LinkedIn, I'm sure. So I would say more business type of functions, but definitely a top four are NGOs, nonprofit, government type stuff, marketing, HR, and consulting.
That's great. And back to you about this sort of this pivot you said earlier. You went from a sociologist to a behavioral scientist, and really, fortunately, the field has been very accepting and welcoming, which I'm glad to hear. What was that like for you, having graduated Ph.D. Harvard as a sociologist, and now you were in this really different and unique position? Did you sit down and sort of look at yourself in the mirror and say, I'm now a behavioral scientist? What was that transition like for you?
No, I did not sit in the mirror and say, okay, Jess, you're a behavioral scientist now. I still some days wake up and I know that I try to identify that way, because I actually do at this point believe that I am, but it has taken me, I think teaching the course on behavioral science was what gave me my confidence of coming out of the closet and being like, okay, guys, I really am a behavioral scientist. I'm not just a behavioral scientist in sociologist clothing, I think that there's a lot of behavioral scientists who will say, like, I'm a psychologist, or I studied economics, or some people call themselves behavioral designers or behavioral practitioners. There's a wide range of vocabulary that we use, but I think for me, what really made me feel like I was a behavioral scientist was being able to have the skills and the background to put together a course that introduces what the field of behavioral science is. And a lot of that was from materials that I found online for free, from podcasts like yours, that just kind of helped me understand that behavioral science is a very diverse field and there's room for all of us. And so, I feel very welcome here, and I'm happy that I can say I'm a behavioral scientist now.
And where do you still fall back on or use or reference yourself as a sociologist within behavioral science? Like, are you a behavioral scientist with a specialization or like sort of a perspective of, sociology? Where does that come in, if at all? And I ask that because I wrestle with the same or with a similar, what might be a similar identity crisis as a social psychologist turned behavioral scientist.
Yes. So within my teaching portfolio, I'm teaching qualitative research methods. I'm a qualitative sociologist by training. So for my dissertation, I did ethnography and interviews. And so when I teach my course, I obviously bring a lot of sociology to the course. When we talk about ethics, I have examples from sociology, from, my field. But I also try to bring in what I've learned about behavioral economics and psychology and other kind of social science disciplines, because the Bachelor is multidisciplinary. So I definitely think that my lens from a behavioral science perspective is more qualitative, and I don't have any experience doing experimentation or any of those kinds of things, which are really valued and a skill that someone else has to teach my students, right? I can teach you focus groups. I can teach you ethnographic observations. We're touching on UX stuff in my course, and then they take another course later on in the Bachelor. But I'm not going to teach you experiments and surveys because I'm a qualitative behavioral scientist just as much as I'm a qualitative sociologist.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I graduated and I did out of PhD. I did some work, like sort of strategy consulting, similar to you, actually, and then I ended up in sort of an entrepreneurial space, and then I branched it on my own to build my own consulting firm. And I'm a trained quant, person, very very stats heavy in graduate school training, and I knew nothing about qual. And I convinced myself that quant was more important than qual, but really that was just because I was trying to like justify my own existence as a scientist. And then my first major client that I won, I don't know how I did, but I did, thank goodness. It was like 80% qualitative and focus groups and these sort of like laboratory ethnographies. And my God, was I a fish out of water. I had no idea what I was doing. And I wish I had some qual training. And really that opened my eyes, and it sort of really forced me to check my own bias of like, what does it mean to do this type of work? And both are necessary. And thank goodness I have that sort of broadened outlook now, because it's just so, the blinders are on if you think that only quant is the way to about it, or only qual is the only way to go about it. It's obviously both, and you need both specializations, and you need training from both experts. So I'm really glad to hear that you give that to your students.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to have an anxiety about being qualitative, because certainly in the field of sociology, psychology, economics, quantitative is prized. It's really valued. So one thing I try to teach my students in class is like, it's our responsibility as your professor to give you tools to be able to do the types of projects that you'll have to do in your careers. I'm here to give you qualitative tools, and sometimes you'll use them and sometimes you'll like them, sometimes you won't. Like some people who are ethnographers don't like interviews and vice versa, right? But you need to expand your toolkit and have all of the tools that are necessary. And if you really want to do science and you want to do social science, you need to have qualitative and quantitative capabilities. Just like I need to know how to run a survey and make survey questions, even if my preference is to do interviews. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Just another tool in the tool belt that you use when it makes sense to use that. And a colleague of mine who I've had on the show, Rima Tepper, she was saying she does a lot of mixed multi-method, multidisciplinary work at a bank, in one of the major banks here in Canada, in Toronto. And what she'll often do is start out with qual and sort of just ask the big broad questions to start, and then that will eventually lead to more of a testable hypothesis that she can collect data, and then it goes from the qualitative to interview to quantitative prediction modeling and testing and gathering data and analyzing data. But she says it's sort of that's the flow of trying to just figure out a problem and answer a really interesting or complicated question. And so of course we need both. It's just in psychology there's a bit of an attitude when it comes to the quant being better. So we're here to say once and for all that is certainly not the case, and that's not what we as behavioral scientists espouse. Yes?
Yes, 100%.
Good. So you've talked about this on a couple times now throughout our chat, just your work in intergroup relations and intergroup dynamics and immigration policy. How does that factor into this program specifically? And there's sort of initiatives where you're building in your expertise on those topics with your current position and the work with your students?
Yeah, so I wish that it fit more nicely into the study plan of the Bachelor, but if you could imagine that we already have to kind of give a little taste of all the social science disciplines, there's not really a space for, thinking about my work specifically as a full course. But I talk about my work in my qualitative methods class as an example of how to put together a qualitative project. And I share my findings because it's also interesting for them, because it's about the city that they live in. And a lot of them belong to the immigrant groups that I studied. So I came to Madrid to study Nigerian, Dominican, and Moroccan immigrants. And I also studied the Spanish perspective. So I would say that my work in intergroup relations is kind of the closest that I got to psychology. One of my advisors at Harvard was kind of in between social psychology and sociology. But I'm excited because next semester I'm actually teaching a course for another program for the humanities department. That's about cross-cultural understanding and diversity and thinking about how we apply those concepts as college students and what we need to learn from our unique college experience at IE University to be able to function in a world that is not as diverse as our university, of course, but like a world that we're striving for, to have these levels of diversity with, hundreds of nationalities on our campus. We hope to have them in our workplaces and organizations and businesses and universities where we work as professors, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm finding ways to be able to incorporate my work and my passions into other courses. I'm also working with one of the centers that they have at IE with the Africa Center to do some research, actually as a scholar in residence, that examines kind of the Black experience at IE. Maybe you can't tell because you can't see my face and you're just listening, but I'm a Black woman from California and I live in Madrid. And so my identity plays into how I navigate my experience. So I think that it's just important for me as a Black American woman to make sure that I'm teaching my students at this diverse institution about, the values of cultural diversity. We talk about some of the biases and the challenges that we face. And I'm using that in this research program that I'm doing about understanding the Black experience to really just give a taste of, what it's like to be a student of color at IE, particularly a Black student, especially in times of Black Lives Matter and all the things that have been going on in the United States. So especially lately, now that the program's a little more developed, I'm finding ways within the university to be able to channel my expertise and kind of put together these courses that bring together ideas of my work in diversity and inclusion with behavioral science and intergroup relations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And going back to that dissertation, to your PhD, what can you give us a little taste of what you looked at specifically, what you found, what were some interesting takeaways? It's just a fascinating sort of topic, so I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, so my dissertation project was born out of my experience as a Black woman in Barcelona when I was studying abroad in college. And I kind of planted the seedling then, and I moved back to Madrid to do my dissertation research. But at the time, I was thinking just about Blackness. And my research to kind of my literature review to get my dissertation off the ground made me realize that Blackness in Europe isn't the same as Blackness in the United States. And the way that you conceptualize race and racism in Europe is fundamentally different from that of the United States. So my project went from being about the Black experience in Spain to thinking about Blackness and race as a spectrum, which is why I included the Moroccan immigrants. I don't know if you're as familiar with the, immigration crisis in Europe, but the conversation is not entirely about Black African immigrants crossing into Spanish territory or Italian territory in boats. That's part of the conversation. But a lot of the racism that you find in Europe is against Arab or Middle Eastern or Muslim people, the hijab. It's kind of this cultural racism as opposed to Black versus white, right? So then there's groups that fit in these weird undetermined categories. Like there's a very large Chinese population in Madrid and nobody knows what to do with them. They're not Spanish. They don't really integrate. They're making their own quote unquote Chinatown. And, they weren't a part of my study, but I'm interested in this idea of how groups that are outside come and form part of the community and the identity. Because in the US and Canada, you can be Jamaican, Canadian, you could be African American, and you're still American. But in Spain, they're not quite at the point where you have a hyphenated identity. Even if you're part Latin American, or even if you were born in Spain, but you come from African ancestry, they're going to still look at you and think, where in Africa are you from, right? They don't understand that there are Spanish people whose parents are African, but they're Spanish. They were born and raised in Spain. Spain is their language that they speak. That's how they think. So it's a really interesting time to think about questions of race and identity and culture in Europe, because some of them are just for the first time receiving immigrants from countries like, Nigeria or Morocco or Lebanon or China, right?
That's really interesting, and something that I, for instance, and given everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter here in North America, that at least what I'm exposed to in the media and conversations, I don't hear the experiences of people in Europe, and obviously it's very different. And I find that really interesting of why that's different. Is it because it's just so much more complex in Europe, given that there's so many more neighboring states and countries, whereas in North America, it's one very large country, and two, Canada and North America, and it's like the immigration is from one's heritage culture to the host culture, from like say somewhere in Africa to the US. And so that for the people who live there is just easier to wrap their head around. It's like you are as you said, Jamaican Canadian, versus in Madrid or some European city, there's more to it. Is that what it is? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I'm just, I guess the question is, I'm curious why it's different in Europe, and possibly why it's more complicated.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is in Canada or the US, you have second, third, fourth generation. Like for me, I don't know what country in Africa my ancestry comes from. I'm American as far back as I can trace, and that's because I'm slave descending, etc. Right? So we have people for many generations who are Black or brown or Asian or whatever who also are American. Whereas in a place like Spain, which suffered a lot after the Second World War, they were under this Franco regime, which was fascist, and they went through a big crisis after the war. So just recently, maybe 25, 30 years ago, they started receiving immigrants who are like, Spain seems like a nice country to live in. So they're having the first generation of people who are Black or brown that are born into this culture, right? There's also different histories of colonialization. So we have the UK US connection, but Spain, the sun never set on a Spanish place. That's the saying, where they had the Philippines, they had lots of places in Latin America and Central America. They have one solitary African former colony, right? So they have a lot more geographic dispersion of people who speak Spanish but aren't European, which is now a type of identity, right? They have the EU, we have a solitary way of payments, but we speak Spanish, they speak French, you speak German, right? So there's a lot of complex identities that came out in my dissertation, which is like, first of all, Blackness is not monolithic. My Blackness here is really enveloped in my Americanness. So it gives me this kind of credibility and legitimacy that I don't have as a Black American in the US, right? It's exotic and interesting to be Black here in ways that it's not in the US, because we have 5 generations of Black people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's just kind of some of the layers. And there was a lot of interesting things that came up for me about culture, about religion. Spain is a Catholic country. So I had, Catholic Nigerians saying that they feel like they really relate to Spanish culture because they got in through the church and their parish community. There's a lot of angles that you can think about inclusion and incorporation. And I tried to touch on those with the 3 immigrant groups in my dissertation project.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing that. And it just seems so relevant. Like, it's fascinating from a purely sort of research academic perspective, as we're sort of discussing here, but it's also very, very relevant and has an applied focus in education and with your students, especially at IE, in the workplace as employees, with and as we see D&I initiatives really taking off in multiple countries around the world, and then also as just in the marketplace with customers and consumers. So I had Tammy Kim on the show. I haven't released her episode yet, but talking to her about the racial inequalities when it comes to customer interaction with customer-facing employees. So these things are coming to the surface. We're obviously having conversations about them now, perhaps more than ever. And so research like yours that you did, although it's specific to this, to this one context, it generalizes and certainly extrapolates in many areas, specifically as what listeners who are interested in sort of more private in workplace and marketplace context. So Very, very cool. Is there a link to your thesis that we can
Oh man,
post?
I think I put the 5-year hold on it, but I've been seeing students that cite my work, so it might not be public, but I'll share it with you. I'll give you a
Okay.
copy of it, and you can post it.
Appreciate that. Very cool. One last question for you, if you don't mind, Jess.
No problem.
BBB, the big behavioral brainstorm. So, of all the problems that we face as humans now, which one, if you had to choose only one, do you think could stand from a behavioral science or social science perspective?
Yeah, I mean, you set me up on this one because I've been on my dissertation, culture, race, and inclusion kind of tangent. And I'm still a big believer in that. Even though I'm not doing research in that area, I think thinking about applying what I learned from my dissertation in these different contexts, like you said, I think thinking about, last week we had the US elections and, this kind of divided nature of my own country, but also the divided nature of countries around the world where we're kind of doing this us and them, kind of who belongs, who's our identity, who can be a part of this society. I feel like behavioral science and social science, all the things that we've been talking about for the past hour, kind of come together for me as the big issue of just kind of cohesion and community, dealing with issues of inequality, of racism. I find that the lens that I've been able to develop from becoming a behavioral scientist myself makes me realize how useful it is for the areas that I think are important, which are around these ideas of inclusion, racism and discrimination, inequalities. So I would put my money on that one.
Thank you. It's been great, Jess. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for the work you're doing at IE. It's really exciting. I think I speak on behalf of the professional community, behavioral scientists, that we need this and we need more of it. So if there's anyone else out there who's thinking about creating a similar group in some other institution around the world, go ahead and do it and apply for that funding and that grant because we need more of it. So yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for this research that you're doing. And but most importantly, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It was fun. It was my pleasure.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in this episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting and easy to apply sciencey stuff. Just head on over to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. The show is edited and co-produced by Laura Christine and Noelle Rain, and visual artwork, banners, and animated GIFs created by the talented Iris Deng of dengit.org. That's DENGIT.org. Definitely go and check it out. Lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcast fix. Quite a bit of work goes into these episodes, and a little love would go a long way. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.